Today's word is from Mark 1:29 through 39. As soon as they left the synagogue, they entered the house of Simon and Andrew with James and John. Now Simon's mother-in-law was in bed with a fever, and they told him about her at once. He came and took her by the hand and lifted her up. Then the fever left her, and she began to serve them. That evening at sundown, they brought to him all who were sick or possessed with demons, and the whole city was gathered around the door. And he cured many who were sick with various diseases and cast out many demons. And he would not permit the demons to speak because they knew him. In the morning, while it was still very dark, he got up and went out to a deserted place, and there he prayed. And Simon and his companions hunted for him. When they found him, they said to him, "Everyone is searching for you." He answered, "Let us go on to the neighboring towns, so that I may proclaim the message there also, for that is what I came out to do." And he went throughout Galilee, proclaiming the message in their synagogues and casting out demons. This is the word of life. Thanks be to God.
Thanks, Peggy. All right. In her 1989 book, The Writing Life, Annie Dillard reminds us of something that is at once obvious and shocking. How we spend our days is, of course, how we spend our lives. What we do with this hour and that one is what we are doing. So those with the grass is greener, or as soon as I, whatever, fill in the blank, I will take a look at that approach to life, may find that this straightforward truth is disconcerting. What we do day by day, hour by hour, is how we live our life, right? And if we're honest with ourselves, we often miss this point and write off the multitude of those days as though they don't count, the ones where we get tied up in other things, those days we spend getting to where we believe we need to go before we can begin to invest our time in all the shoulda, coulda, woulda things that we tell ourselves we'll get to once this stuff is done, right? Days filled with intention, purpose, and meaning, those things that we'll get to. Days meticulously scheduled and faithfully executed. Days marked by attentiveness and order and devotion and beauty, because that's every day for all of us, right? No. When we get around to living those days, then we'll sculpt our best life. Unless we stop for a moment and acknowledge that Dillard is right. Our mundane getting to their hours are just as telling, and maybe more so, as our occasional mountaintop moments where it all comes together. How we spend our days is how we spend our lives, which lends weight and poignancy to today's story from Mark's Gospel, a day in the life of Jesus. As Jesus begins his public ministry, Mark offers this opportunity to follow him around for 24 hours, observing what he does and what he says and what he prioritizes. In typical Markan fashion, this section of the gospel races from one event to the next, favoring speed over depth. So we don't hear a lot of the story, but we do hear all of the things he does. And yet, if we look carefully, we can find moments to linger over and lessons to savor as we journey with Jesus in this way. So, a day in the life and how Jesus spends it. First of all, he makes home sacred. The lectionary reading begins with Jesus leaving the synagogue after Sabbath worship, entering the home of Simon and Andrew, and spending the rest of the day there. This might sound like a trivial detail, but I love that Jesus lingers there in their home, blessing an otherwise seemingly humdrum everyday location simply by being there and being present, and honoring it as a sacred site where the work of God's kingdom goes forward. We know from the rest of the Gospels that some of Jesus' most significant encounters happen in homes. He performs his first public miracle at a home in Cana. He raises Jairus' daughter in the synagogue leader's house. His friend Mary anoints him with oil at her home in Bethany. Salvation comes to Zacchaeus when the despised tax collector welcomes Jesus as a house guest. And the disciples on the road to Emmaus recognize Jesus when he breaks bread with them at their dinner table. meaning holy things happen in these places we call home. God's power and presence aren't limited to the official sacred spaces. Our living quarters are not second best when it comes to seeking and finding Jesus, and if anything, Jesus delights in the domestic. He does amazing work in spaces we might consider familiar and ordinary. What would it be like for us to honor our homes in the way that Jesus honors Simon's in today's reading? What would it be like to see and honor our own living spaces as sacred because we know that Jesus is with us there? So that's one of the things. He also heals in this day that we spend with him. Jesus' first act in this week's reading is to heal Simon's mother-in-law. Hearing that she's feverish and bedridden, he goes to her side, takes her hand, lifts her up. And immediately the fever leaves her body and she's restored to health. As word gets out, the whole city gathers around Simon's door some hours later to seek healing for their diseases and demons, and Jesus cares for them as a compassionate healer, curing many. Says Debbie Thomas of Journey with Jesus, I'll be the first to admit that I don't always know what to do with these healing stories. After all, it's been 2,000 years since Jesus walked the earth, ushering in God's kingdom with all manner of miraculous signs and wonders. And Barbara Brown Taylor writes, the problem with miracles is that it's hard to witness them without wanting one of our own. Every one of us knows someone who is suffering or in need, and every one of us knows someone who could really use a miracle. But these days, miracles can seem hard to come by. Again, from Debbie Thomas, I love the healing stories in the gospel, even if they're confusing. I love the power and compassion with which Jesus touches the sick and the suffering, but sometimes I wish that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John had included a few less dramatic stories in their books too. For example, did Jesus ever visit with a feverish woman, take her hand, and simply offer the comfort of his presence without curing her? Did he ever sit in the dark with a profoundly depressed person? Just sit? Did he ever keep vigil at a deathbed and cry with the family as they said goodbye? No resurrection, just tears. Did he ever experience God's no or God's wait when he sought to heal someone? We don't know the answer to these questions, but we do know that Jesus spent many hours of his life offering whatever compassion or healing or liberation he could. In this week's story, he heals many, but not all. He casts out many demons, but not all. Though not all, he still touches everyone who reaches out for help, knowing that touch in and of itself is an instrument of hope and healing. He loves without measure because love cures many ills. He doesn't assume that illness and demon possession are punishments from God because such assumptions are cruel and wounding. He does offer the sick and the broken his steady presence, his warm grip and embrace, and the good news of a kingdom that is coming, a kingdom without sickness, without sorrow, without fear. And in that way, his offers are enough. And this kind of healing is its own kind of miracle, one we all have the capacity to give by spending our days as Jesus spends his, graciously and compassionately, offering the comfort of our steady presence to those who suffer, creating and restoring community and family and dignity to those who walk through this life sick, weak, wounded, and without cure, and making sure that no one who has to die, and that's all of us in the end, dies abandoned and unloved if we can help it. Jesus liberates and commissions during this day. Mark's gospel tells us that as soon as Jesus heals Simon's mother-in-law, she begins to serve. We may envision the poor woman leaping out of bed to serve the men in her house in the second that her fever leaves her, with no rest between illness and cure. But I wonder, the verb that Mark uses to describe the mother-in-law's service is the same verb the Gospels use to describe the angels who attend Jesus after his 40 days in the wilderness. It's the same verb Jesus uses to describe himself when he washes his disciples' feet. I am among you as one who serves. And it's the same verb the early church uses to commission deacons, the servant leaders of the church. Regardless of how we might feel about how this piece of the story actually transpired, there are whole sermons on how could you expect this woman to leap from her bed and serve. Regardless of all of those things. Sorry, lost my place. It's interesting to note, that this unnamed woman recognized and pursues her calling long before her son-in-law and his friends do. So picture this, he's in Simon and Andrew's house with his mother-in-law who's been ill and his wife, and she is healed and wakes up and comes among them as one who serves. While Simon and the gang bumble around following Jesus and getting in his way, this woman just gets to work without hesitation or self-consciousness, engaging in a grateful ministry alongside Jesus. In healing her, Jesus also liberates her and commissions her. We don't really know a whole lot more about this woman's life, but we can assume her ministry is effective. In 1 Corinthians, we read that Simon Peter's wife accompanies him on his apostolic journeys after Jesus' resurrection and ascension. Clearly, Simon's mother-in-law's serving has had an impact on the faith of her daughter and her extended family, that they would do these things together. So in the same way that we're invited to heal, we're also invited to pay attention, to notice, to bless the gifts and abilities of those around us. And this way we, like Jesus, can spend our days as liberators commissioning God's beloved to serve with gratitude and love. This is where I could say, but wait, there's more, because there is. Another thing Jesus does in this 24 hours is that he prays. We hear in the second half of today's reading that the next morning, while it's dark, Mark tells us that Jesus goes to a deserted place to spend time with God. This isn't a one-off. We know from the other Gospels that prayer was one of his daily practices. Luke tells us Jesus often withdrew to lonely places and prayed. And Matthew says, after he had sent the crowds away, he went up on the mountaintop by himself to pray, and when it was evening, he was there alone. In these seemingly minor connecting verses, we see glimpses of Jesus' deeply rooted spiritual life, the source of his strength and vision. We see his need to withdraw, his hunger for solitary prayer, his inclination to rest and recuperate and reorient his heart. Imagine this life of Jesus. This is just one day. And the number of things that he's doing and taking on, the number of healings and touchings and prayers and being present to encounters he has in the course of a day. As a chaplain, we would schedule maybe 3 or 4 patients in a day, and not more, because when you sit with someone for 60 or 90 minutes and hold that space to bear witness to who they are, you need to refuel, and this is what Jesus is doing. These glimpses remind us that Christ, our Messiah, understands the need to find a balance between compassion and self-protection in a world bursting with desperate need. He lives with this tension every day, as do we, and he is unapologetic about his need for rest and solitude. Even as the crowds throng to him, he feels no shame in retreating when he needs a break. Not a bad reminder for those of us who run at 240 most of the time. Where striving is a virtue in our culture and the need for rest is considered a weakness, we forget sometimes to hold a balance there. It's also a challenge to those of us who might think about prayer a lot more than we actually sit and set aside time to pray. There's a question here. When our hours and days are measured, remember Dillard's quote as we started, how many of those will we have spent alone with God? What else does he do? He moves on. Today's reading ends with Jesus leaving Simon's house so he can take the good news of God to other towns, other synagogues, other homes, and do the whole thing again. He makes this decision despite the fact that his disciples interrupt his prayer time to say everyone is still searching for him back at Simon's house. There might have been compelling reasons for Jesus to stay there, but his response is to set a boundary, to say no. to move on in keeping with his own mission and timing and call. From what we know of Jesus, I can't imagine that he makes these kinds of decisions lightly. These are his friends, this is his ministry, that's his congregation he's building. And so I'm sure it costs him something to say, I need to go. But after a morning of prayer and reflection, touching base with God, holding some balance, he recognizes and trusts the voice that says, it's time to go. So if we learn anything from Jesus' choices in this one very full day of his life, let it be these things. We have the capacity to hold calling and timing and need in productive tension. It doesn't have to lean so far over here that we can't get up and move back this way. We have the capacity to trust that sowing a seed and walking away is enough. God's got us. We have the capacity to risk the new and the unknown, to hold firm to our sense of vocation, even when our loved ones don't always understand and agree with our choices. We have the capacity to establish and honor healthy boundaries for ourselves and for the sake of those around us. We have the capacity and the responsibility to sculpt the hours that make up the days that make up our lives, with God as our center and Jesus as our teacher. We have the capacity to embrace the whole of our lives, not when this stuff is done so we can get to those days, but to make them all one. Make sense? There's a meditation by Reverend Stephen Charleston, who's a favorite of mine, who words it this way: you have been chosen to be who you are, not as an accident, not as an existence with no purpose, but as a self-aware soul brought to life by a spirit who knows your name. You have a mission to carry out, a message to send, a blessing to bestow. You are the only one who can live your life, and you are entrusted with a corner of the universe. Wow. You are a stakeholder in creation, selected for a task only you can complete, not when you get around to it, but right now. May we be so, hour by hour, day by day. In Jesus' name, amen.